Well, good morning. Are you ready for our 12th and final tour?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Turn to Matthew chapter 22, beginning in verse 33, and let's read this passage. Jesus had been speaking. When the crowds heard this, they were astonished at his teaching. Hearing that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, the Pharisees got together. One of them, an expert in the law, tested him with this question, "Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law?" Jesus replied, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments." Now, what did Jesus just tell us? All the law and the prophets hang on these two. What is he getting at? He's referring, let's turn to Deuteronomy for a minute. Deuteronomy chapter 6. "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. These commandments that I give you today are to be upon your hearts. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up. Tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads. Write them on the doorframes of your houses and on your gates." Jesus is referring to this. It's not one of the 10, but to some extent it appears to be almost a summation of them. Now, let's look at one more passage. Luke chapter 10, beginning in verse 25. On one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he asked, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" "What is written in the law?" he replied. "How do you read it?" He answered, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself." Now, it's interesting here because in the Old Testament, mind is not part of the list. And instead of repeating the 10 commandments, he repeats the greatest commandment and the second greatest commandment. We don't know, but I think this guy's been listening to Jesus. "You have answered correctly," Jesus replied. "Do this and you will live." A powerful statement by Jesus. And then, this is what we read next. "But he," who is he? The expert in the law. "But he wanted to justify himself, so he asked Jesus, 'And who is my neighbor?'" Well, the answer to that question is going to lead us into this sphere and to talk about what we have lost in terms of understanding of community and the radical design that God has given to us in terms of our responsibilities within this sphere to love our neighbor. So we've looked at all of these spheres. We began by gazing upon the face of God because it was the triune nature of God that helped us understand the fact that God designed social systems. And we learned what it means to submit. We learned what real authority is. Not the way the world twists authority and makes it ugly. Not the way the world says submission is an ugly word. We even talked about delegation of authority. We talked about oneness and unity, and we began to see as we looked at the other spheres that God has created, those social systems, that we began to see that He had stamped that divine image upon each one of those. Whether it was the family or the church, whether it was the state, and we began to realize how God's design was intended to keep this from becoming a huge monster. We looked at the general economic model and how God has given us the opportunity to be His creative stewards, to work with his goods in a creative way. And then we looked at the sphere of labor and understood how we have responsibilities here, whether we are the owner or the employer, whether we are the worker. And if we would but follow God's design in that social system, well, we would turn the world upside down. And so now we come to this sphere. What does it look like? It's a little different than the others because this sphere does not have any authority roles, but it has clear responsibility roles. And that may be why we neglect this so much, because there's no power found in here. Who is my neighbor? He asked. Let's look at this passage again. What was this teacher of the law saying? Jesus had just asked him what the greatest commandment was. He responded with the greatest commandment and the second greatest commandment. But then it says that he wanted to justify himself. So he asked Jesus, who is my neighbor? What was going on here? What was he trying to do? What do you suppose this teacher of the law was looking for?
Checklist.
A checklist. Yeah. Hey, I can handle that one. Why don't you just give me the list and I'll take care of that. You know, we like that. This man was trying to justify himself, trying to find some way that he could say that he was clean before the law. And Jesus is just about to pierce the heart. So let's look at it. His question, who is my neighbor, to Jesus? And then we get this incredible story that you and I are familiar with. And it is typically called what? The parable of the Good Samaritan. I'm going to rename it for a minute because we're going to call it the story of the good neighbor. And let's read it. In reply to this man's statement, okay, who is my neighbor? Jesus said, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he fell into the hands of robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So too a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. He then put the man on his own donkey, took him to an inn and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 silver coins and gave them to the innkeeper. Look after him, he said, and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have. Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? The expert in the law replied, the one who had mercy on him. Jesus told him, go and do likewise. What a story. It's even more interesting when you begin to realize that at that time, the Jews despised Samaritans. They would go way out of their way not to travel through Samaria. And now Jesus has told a story. Both the priest and the Levite passed by a man who was in desperate need. And it was the Samaritan who stopped. In our current language, what he did is he picked up this man, he bandaged him as best he could, he took him to a hotel, and he left his credit card at the hotel. Whatever he needs, I'll take care of it. Who proved to be a neighbor? Jesus asked. And my guess is this teacher of the law probably said as quietly as he could, he wouldn't say the word, the Samaritan. He said, the man who took pity on him. Jesus said, go and do likewise. So, here we have this story. What was the question? What was the first question?
Who is my neighbor?
Who is my neighbor? Did Jesus answer the question?
Yeah.
I don't think so. What was he looking for?
Checklist.
A list. I think Jesus did what he always did. When people ask a question, Jesus didn't answer the question. He responded with what the guy really needs. I don't think he gave him a list of who his neighbor was. He told him what a neighbor was. He said, let me show you what a neighbor is. The neighbor was not the man who had been beaten up by the robbers. Who was the neighbor? The man who took care for him. Jesus said, go and be a neighbor. And this is what a neighbor looks like. We're going to build this sphere right now. We're going to ask ourselves the question, what does this thing look like? What is God's design? And we're going to use this story of Jesus to help us understand. And the first thing, I'll just write this up here for you. Because what we're going to see in the sphere of the community, we're going to take these two main characters of the story. Let's start with the neighbor, right? Jesus called him the neighbor. Who else? The needy. The man who is needy. Now, before we fill this in, I want us to ponder the Word of God for a minute. Because that's what we need to look at. Because we want to find what is it about God, what is the heart of God that has caused Him to create this sphere and to give us these deep responsibilities of which we have mostly turned away from. Let me read a few of these passages and see if you can begin to sense the heart of God. 1 Samuel 2, He raises the poor from the dust and lifts the needy from the ash heap. He seats them with princes and has them inherit a throne of honor. Job 5:11, the lowly He sets on high, and those who mourn are lifted to safety. Psalm 12:5, because of the oppression of the weak and the groaning of the needy, I will now arise. I will protect them from those who malign them. Psalm 72, He will defend the afflicted from among the people and save the children of the needy. He will crush the oppressor. Psalm 138, though the Lord is on high, He looks upon the lowly, but the proud He knows from afar. Who else should go in this sphere?
God.
Yeah. I'm going to write Christ here. We'll come back and talk about it. But did you get a sense from those verses that God has a deep heart for the needy? He is the one who's going to arise and protect them. So this is the sphere that we're going to begin to gaze upon and look at. Let's revisit one of those passages. Because of the oppression of the weak and the groaning of the needy, I will now arise, says the Lord. I will protect them from those who malign them. This should be a fearful thing. We need to begin to understand the heart of God and why this sphere is so close to His nature and being and character. This is not one for us to neglect. And so, we'll take a look at this design. God is serious about this idea that we need to be good neighbors. Who are the needy? Who are they?
Poor.
The poor,
Afflicted.
the afflicted,
Orphans.
orphans,
Widows.
widows, sick, prisoners. Those are the easy ones. What about the outcasts? Are they needy? When I was in grade school, right off the bat, I was an outcast. Made fun of, laughed at, joked about, ignored. And so I should have known better. At one point in grade school, not because of anything I have, but God just gave me the ability to play athletics, and I was good in my academics. And so at some point, I kind of overcame all that, and I became not an outcast, but kind of one of the in crowd. And I should have known better because I know what it's like to be on the other side. There was a young girl in our school. From our perspective, she was not attractive. She had a square chin that jutted out. And the more we teased her, the more she began to play the part and come to school with her hair ratted out. We called her the Foo. And whenever she would come around, we'd all yell, "Ooh, the Foo," and we'd run. One of my deep prayers and longings is that if this young girl did not commit suicide, that I may someday have the opportunity to tell her how sorry I am for the way we treated her. You can destroy someone's life when you begin to treat them like an outcast. Do you not think the heart of God weeps for the outcast? It does. Do you suppose that God doesn't hear the cries of the needy? No, don't fool ourselves. He hears them even though they remain silent. Who are the needy? The outcasts, the unpopular, the neglected, the left out. I remember very clearly my first dance. Now, this may seem strange to you, but back in the old days when I was in school, we had what we called sock hops. I don't know what we called them that. I guess it's because you took your shoes off and you hopped around. But it was in the younger grade, and so we didn't go with dates. We just went to the dance, and it was at the gymnasium. And the girls would sit on this side, and the guys would sit on this side. And the music would start, and the guys would, at that time, I know this is strange to you today, the guys would ask the girls to dance. And I came home from my first dance, and I will never forget my dad met me as I came in the door. And he said, "Hey, did you have a good time? First dance." I said, "Well, yeah, I did." "Did you dance with any girls?" Yeah, I danced with actually quite a few." "Did they have fun?" "Well, I think they did." "Did everybody have fun at the dance tonight?" I said, "Yeah, I think so." He said, "Were there any girls that nobody asked to dance?" And I said, "Well, yeah, there are a couple girls that nobody asked." He said, "Do you suppose they had fun?" I said, "Well, maybe not." And I'll never forget, he looked at me, he said, "Del, Next time you go to a dance, ask the girls that nobody will ask and help them to have a good time. That's the heart of my dad. Always thinking of the left out. He always had a heart for the outcast. And that's the heart of our Father. That is the heart of our Father. The left out, the homely, the last. Oh, there are lots of others. The needy are great, and they are everywhere in a sphere that we neglect. Or we see if we can't just hire somebody to take care of it for us. That's not God's design. A man by the name of Alvin Schmidt has written a book. We'll talk about it a little bit later, but the title is How Christianity Changed the World. And he recounts in here when the Romans were throwing their babies over the bridges into the river because they just didn't want them. It was the Christians that got into boats and with nets fished them out of the river. A man by the name of John Pounds who saw the ragged children in England with no parents, no home. Because of his understanding of what Christ had called him to do, he formed what was called John Pounds' Ragged School for Children. It is a radical view coming into a world in which some would say survival of the fittest. The weak need to be destroyed. That makes us all better. What a radical view. But listen to the heart of God. He raises the poor from the dust and lifts the needy from the ash heap. Do not take advantage of a hired man who is poor and needy. He saves the needy from the sword in their mouth. He saves them from the clutches of the powerful. He will defend the afflicted among the people and save the children of the needy. He will crush the oppressor. The lowly he sets on high. Those who mourn are lifted to safety. Though the Lord is on high, he looks upon the lowly, but the proud he knows from afar. My whole being will exclaim, who is like you, O Lord? You rescue the poor from those too strong for them, the poor and needy from those who rob them. That ought to be our cry. Who is this God? Who of the other gods that man has created has a heart for the lowly? Do those gods care for the weak? No, they crush the weak. Do they care for the contrite in heart? No, they are to be despised. Who is this God? It is that question that threw me into my longest and most difficult cocoon. And this is the jewel in the cave. And so I began to struggle with this question, but it wasn't until a student asked me about an aspect of God's nature that I began to wrestle deeply with this question. Here's what it is. As we begin to turn and look upon the face of God, remember our foundations. What are our presuppositions or our foundations?
God is.
God is, and
He is revealed.
He has revealed Himself. And how has He revealed Himself? In His general revelation and in His special revelation in His written word. In class, a student asked me, rightly, because he had properly understood that whenever you begin to turn and gaze upon some area of life, you must first ask yourself, what is it about the nature of God we must refresh ourselves with before we launch on this study? And so he raised his hand and he said, what is it about the nature of God that causes him to reveal himself to us? And I said, I don't know. I've never thought about that. Who is this God? Isaiah 65, I revealed myself to those who did not ask for me. I was found by those who did not seek me. To a nation that did not call on my name, I said, here am I. Here am I. All day long I've held up my hands to an obstinate people who walk in ways not good, pursuing their own imaginations. Who is this God? Who is this God who stands and weeps over Jerusalem and says, oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those sent to you, how often I have longed to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing. What kind of a God is this? So I had this early struggle. Who is this? I want to know who this is. And then it was reading this passage in Matthew chapter 11 that almost turned the lights out in my cocoon. Come to me, all you are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, Jesus is saying, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. And I began to search. Do you know it's the only place I could find where Jesus now tells us what his heart is? And he said his heart was gentle and humble. Whoa, you talk about going through a metamorphosis, because for me, the idea that God was somehow humble was just totally foreign to me, because to me, God was a fierce God. So God began to work on me. And we who with unveiled faces all reflect the Lord's glory are being metamorphed into his likeness with ever-increasing glory, which comes from the Lord who is the Spirit. And let me tell you, that transformation is not easy. For me, it was extremely difficult. And so I found myself in the big cocoon. What does this mean, dear Jesus? And so I began to look at the words. I said, oh, you know what? I bet this Greek word for humble is not the same word that God talks about us being humble. The word is tapainos. Well, guess what? It is the same word. Luke 1, he has performed mighty deeds with his arm. He has scattered those who are proud in their inmost thoughts. He has brought down rulers from the thrones, but he has lifted up the humble. Tapainos. James 4, 6, but he gives us more grace. That is why the scripture says God is opposed to the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Tapainos. Verse 10, humble yourselves before the Lord, and he will lift you up. Do you remember the Last Supper? John chapter 13, where Jesus has brought together his disciples, and they are eating the Passover feast before he was about to sacrifice himself for us. By the way, they were probably seated at what we call the triclinium. The triclinium is simply a three-sided table. We don't know for sure, but this is probably the way they were seated. The host was here. The honored guest was here. And then the disciples were seated probably around this triclinium. Who do you suppose this was?
Jesus.
Judas. Jesus was the honored guest. Who was this?
John.
John, remember, he leaned on Jesus' breast. Who do you suppose this is?
Peter.
Peter. And you recall, Jesus did something at this time. He got up and he began to wash their feet. He went around the table. I used to think that Peter was very humble when we said, Lord, you're not going to wash my feet. But you know what? I think it was pride. Jesus said, if I do not wash your feet, you have no part in me. And Peter says, do it.
Oh, my body.
Yeah. Wash me all over. So I'm reading this passage. And then all of a sudden comes the killer. We're still in the midst of this upper room, and you're familiar with this passage. Let me read it to you from John chapter 14, beginning in verse 4. You know the way to the place where I'm going, Jesus said. Thomas said to him, Lord, we don't know where you're going, so how can we know the way? Jesus answered, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. If you really knew me, you would know my Father as well. From now on, you do know him and have seen him. Philip said, Lord, show us the Father, and that will be enough for us. And Jesus answered, don't you know me, Philip? Even after I have been among you such a long time? Anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. And I fell to my knees because Jesus had just given them one of the greatest signs of humility in washing their feet. And Philip says, hey, show us the Father, that'll be enough. And Jesus says, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. And I began to realize that the God whom we serve is a God who has a humble heart. Why does God call us to be holy?
Because he's holy.
Because he is holy. Why are we to be perfect? Because he is perfect. Why are we to be humble? Because he's arrogant?
No.
Why does he say, my heart is with the contrite and the lowly, but the proud I see from afar? Because the proud heart is contrary to his nature. Oh, that has radically changed me. Now, lest you think that this may somehow demean God. Oh, no. Let me paint two pictures for you. Two kings, each of them equally powerful. Let's say this king owns half of the earth and this king owns the other half of the earth. Wealthy beyond even description, powerful beyond description. This king would never speak to a peasant. This king, at the end of the day, when his duties are done, he puts on a ragged cloak and he goes down into the streets and he talks with the peasants. Which king is greater? Oh, yes. That is the God whom we serve. What is the nature of God? Behind the fact that he reveals himself to us, behind the fact that he stands all day and says, here I am, here I am. Who says, I will now arise for the cause of the weak and the needy. We serve a God whose heart is humble. Don't mistake this in the same way we might mistake the idea when God says his name is jealous. Remember we talked about that? It's not the jealousy, the sinful jealousy. Do not mistake this understanding of humbleness and humility. I'll give it to you to search it out deeply. 2 Timothy says this, God did not give us a spirit of timidity, but a spirit of power, of love, and self-discipline. Humility is not timidity. I remember reading a book a long, long time ago, and it's the title that stays with me. It was a book about Jesus, but it was the title that said, the title was The Man of Steel and Velvet. Yes, Jesus, meek, gentle, humble in heart, but he is also the one that took the whip. He is also the one who stood before the Pharisees and the teachers in the law. He says, you brood of vipers, you hypocrites. He was not timid. Humility is not timidity. But when you begin to look at what the Spirit gives to us, think about the fruit of the Spirit. love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, mercy, long-suffering. Oh, do you see the heart of God? My whole being will exclaim, who is like you, O Lord? You rescue the poor from those too strong for them, the poor and the needy from those who rob them. Who is this God? Jesus said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. Why is that the greatest commandment? Why is this the second greatest commandment? Love your neighbor as yourself. You do not understand this until you gaze upon the face of God. Father Sirico understands deeply the need to treat our neighbors right and why we should.
The thing that made Christian charity distinct from philanthropy was the view of the human person. When the Christian confronts human need, the Christian does that with the sense that the being who stands before us is an eternal being. C.S. Lewis says, you have never met a mere mortal. Everyone you have ever come in contact with, you've argued with or traded with, every one of them is either an immortal horror or an everlasting splendor. But you have never met a mere mortal. And he reminds us how sacred the human person is. He says that the most sacred thing that presents itself to our senses next to the Blessed Sacrament itself is our neighbor.
You've never met a mere mortal. You remember Flash. He is not just a mere mortal. He has a story as well. Does anyone take time to listen to it, to understand it? Let's do that.
Family to me is important. It shouldn't be by all rights to me because I didn't have much of a family. You know, my mother wasn't a mother, she was a monster. Severe alcoholic. My dad wasn't never there. You know, you get beat, you get burnt with cigarettes, you get, yeah, that ain't family. That's, my dad wasn't there to see it, and, you know, I had bad happen. And so I grew up a hater. I grew up locked up most of my life, you know, growing up. Ooh, that ain't fun. That ain't fun. And then you get shunned. I used to go to church, and I got called a pagan. I didn't know what the hell that meant until last year. I'm like, how the hell am I a pagan? You know? I've been there longer than you, Churchy, you know? I remember I got a picture of me and my twin brother, our first birthday. We each had a cake. And it was at church. And this lady, Millie Craig, she was ended up being a friend of my father's later on, but I remember her my whole life growing up. Even when I wasn't in church, she'd come by and say, hey, you know, because that's true Christianity, I guess, would be Millie. That would have been true. Because she literally lived like a Christian. You know, I don't say not everybody isn't, you know. I just said 90%. It's very rare that you really find that person because it's like, wow, you can tell. I mean, you can really tell. If you believe, you believe. I don't care. I believe in me. You know what I'm saying? Religion, period, all the way. Because I just don't believe. That's just crap. That's called power, and that's called crap to me. But Christianity is a little bit, you know, at least I'll give a true Christian props. As long as he, you know, if you do what you say you are, you know, then how can I take that away from you? Yeah, I won't. But there, I have met, but very few. I won't even hold up a finger. You know, it's that few. So, when my dad died, that broke my heart. Not knowing if I thought we were friends, but I didn't know he had Alzheimer's, you know, or what that was about. Like I said, I was a bastard my whole life. I thought he hated me, you know, my stupidity. And then I hated him. I hated my whole family. Of course, I hated myself. But it was too late, I think. I'll never know, so that's the worst part. And then not knowing if I got to be his friend, that broke my heart. Not seeing my son every day breaks my heart. Not seeing certain friends breaks my heart. A lot of things. I got a lot of heart. And thank God, because it gets broke in pieces a lot. I still have it, though. Yeah, there's a lot of things that break my heart. I already know what's going to happen to Flash when I die. I'm going to die. I'm going to become food for some worms, you know what I mean? And then a lot of people are going to cry. A lot of people will be happy, maybe. And you know what? And then that's another part of the cycle of life. You know, you can't have life without death. You know? I ain't so much worried about it. I was already supposed to have been dead. I've been through some very heavy trauma lately, and I'm overcoming a lot, and they don't even know why, the doctors, you know? So why worry? Why worry about the small stuff? You live life, don't let life live you. That's the way I see it. So I'm gonna die happy, regardless if it was tomorrow.
You've never met a mere mortal. The people who live next door to you, the people who work in the shop that you drive by every day, they are not mere mortals. Do you think God doesn't know his story? Do you think God did not hear his cries and he's locked up? Hoping to finally make amends with his dad and find out he has Alzheimer's disease? Do you not think God weeps? Why are we not involved? We don't care sometimes. You know, it is amazing to me that this final topic that we come to, involvement, has somewhat become a debate in Christian circles between those who say, why polish brass on a sinking ship? Now, let me tell you, babies being ripped apart in the womb are not brass railings on a ship. And God has not called us to simply shrink away. How do we know that? All we have to do is look at him. He listens and he touches. He comforts and he disciplines. He dwells within us and he intercedes. He protects us, he guides us, he provides our every need. He is the vine and he gives us life. He has spoken to us in his word, and he keeps us from temptations that we cannot bear. He is deeply involved. God is not apathetic. He does not abstain. He does not abdicate his responsibilities to fulfill his promises. He is faithful to the end. He is a father to the fatherless. He defends the weak and the needy. He is righteous and he does what is right. He sends rain on the just and the unjust. You cannot accuse God of copping out. He doesn't bail. He doesn't flee. He never retreats and he never abandons the battle. He is deeply involved. He takes the evil king to task and he judges the wicked. He opposes the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. He hears the cries of his people. He listens to them, and he answers our prayers. His providential hand has been felt by those who've come before us, and it will be felt by those who come after us. He brings peace in the midst of trials. He opens the prison doors. He sets the captives free. He is present in the foxhole, and he knows when a sparrow falls. He is the ever-present, the ever-near, the everlasting Father. He has not abandoned us, and he will not forsake us. He is involvement. If you want to follow him, then you must engage in the battle.
The world is reeling, absolutely reeling with uncertainty. It's almost like it's in the air.
One after another, people are saying it's all over. I think that's dead wrong.
We're challenged to either confront culture, to abandon it, or transform it.
I have never sensed a more momentous occasion than now.
We have an opportunity now to transform it before we abandon it.
We have at least 10 to 15, maybe 20 years, only God knows, some point before the culture passes a point of no return.
We haven't engaged the culture to an extent that has meant our presence has been consistent or believable. We've got a serious credibility gap.
So when you sit down next to, say, a devout follower of one of these other worldviews and we start talking with them, the first thing they say is, you don't even know what I believe.
We have got to have a more animated, a more revolutionary approach to the way we live our lives in community. We have tremendous opportunities today, but we have got to understand the dynamic influences that shape the way people think and the way culture is formed.
You must ask the questioner questions to understand their own assumptions and determine the entry point of the discussion. So we have to pay the price of study and understanding. So both what we believe and what the other person believes is the key to understanding this next century.
We have something so different, so compelling, that the distinction itself, by contrast, is attractive, will draw people because of its radical nature.
If we don't engage the culture, if we don't understand where they are, we don't understand their needs, how are we going to fulfill what God has called us to do? You remember the story of Jonah? Jonah was a faithful prophet until God comes to him and says, I want you to go to Nineveh. They are in great need. And Jonah running from the face of God. How foolish! How often have I run away from the face of God? Jonah thinks he can get away from God. No, he does not. The story of Jonah is a great story. God raises up a great wind, a great storm, a great fish. But you know what? The focus of the story is the great city. This great city. Remember the story? Jonah preaches to Nineveh, and then he goes up onto a hill, almost hoping that he'll see the brass railings on the ship sink. It was a hot day, and God raised up a vine to shade him, and then he raised up a worm to eat the vine. And Jonah got angry because the vine was gone. And then God comes to him, and he says this, do you have a right to be angry about the vine? I do, he said. I'm angry enough to die. But the Lord said, you have been concerned about this vine, though you did not tend it or make it grow. It sprang up overnight and died overnight. But Nineveh has more than 120,000 people who cannot tell their right hand from their left. Should I not be concerned about that great city? Nineveh was a pagan city. Do you think God is not concerned with this culture around us that has so deeply bought the lies? Oh, don't run away from the face of God. He has called us to transform our culture. In Schmidt's book, he goes through point after point of how our brothers and sisters who have preceded us have transformed the world. We're the ones that help people understand that there is a sanctity to human life, the elevation of sex and what it really means. We're the ones who began to reach out in charity and compassion and the dignity of women, all the things. We built the hospitals. That is your heritage. Those who have come before us. One of the great heroes of the faith, William Wilberforce. You may know his story. William Wilberforce was a sickly man. Later on in his life, he had to have a metal brace to hold his back up. He was born into a wealthy family, and he had a natural ability at eloquence and humor, and so he found himself elected as one of the youngest people elected to Parliament in England. He was a playboy, living for himself. And then he was transformed by Jesus Christ. And then he mistakenly believed that he should leave Parliament and pursue sacred work. But he was persuaded properly, no, this is where God has placed you. And going before the Lord, he began to realize that God had placed before him two objects, the abolition of the slave trade and the reformation of manners. And so he began to prepare himself. And he delivered a very eloquent speech on the floor of Parliament to do away with the slave trade. He was hooted at and hollered. He went back and prepared himself again, and the next year he came and delivered a more eloquent speech. More hoots, more hollers. He prepared himself more, and at the same time began to work with his parliamentarians to show him Christ. Year after year he came back, year after year and year after year and year after year, and 26 years. He delivered another eloquent speech, and Parliament voted to abolish the slave trade. And they rose and applauded the man who bowed his head and wept. But that was only the beginning, because he came back the next year, and he then delivered a speech to free the slaves. And that's when the death threats came. But he came back year after year after year, 46 years after he began, only 3 days before his death. The bill to abolish slavery in the British Empire passed. He was not present because he was lying on his bed dying. Slavery existed all over the world, and it was the British Empire that began. Much money, much blood to destroy slavery. Do you think William Wilberforce is not listed in the Hall of Faith? Oh, yes, he is. Pollock summarizes his life this way. He says his whole life was animated by a deeply held personal faith in Jesus Christ. He had a deep sense of calling that grew into conviction that he was to exercise his spiritual purpose in the realms of his secular responsibility. He was committed to the strategic importance of a band of like-minded friends devoted to working together in chosen ventures. Do not work alone. He believed deeply in the power of ideas and moral beliefs to change culture through sustained public persuasion. Oh, the world was not worthy of him. He was willing to pay a steep cost for his courageous public stands and was persistent in pursuing his life task. He had every reason to abandon the battle because he was a sickly man who oftentimes had trouble getting out of his house because of the internal illness in his frame. Every reason to say, no, let someone else do it. We're in good company. A cloud of witnesses. This is Hebrew 11. The scroll is being unrolled. I pray that your name will be in it. I pray that my name will be in it. The early Christians, the later Christians, the world was not worthy of them. Father Sirica will give us one last picture of what lays before us.
There is a story from the 2nd century, and it was a Roman soldier who was stationed in Antioch, and a plague had broken out in Antioch. And we have extant a copy of the missive that he sends back to Rome. And he says something to this effect. He says, this plague has broken out, and everybody is moving out of the city. I've moved the troops back for their own safety. Families have abandoned their loved ones. The doctors have even left. Of course, all the politicians are out. But one curious thing is happening. There is a sect in Antioch who are themselves, some of them not infected, who are taking care of the dying. And they do this out of love for this God that they worship, whom they call, and I think he mispronounces or miswrites the name, Christus, something to that effect. And it's very interesting to see, so early on in Christianity, that believers were willing to risk themselves to tend to those who were vulnerable.
What a great cloud of witnesses, those who have come before us. We need to stand and take care of what God has called us to take care of in the culture that He's placed us in. There are a lot of you who have asked me this question, and I have put you off. Several have come up and said, what do we do? What do I do? And I said, I'm not going to answer that question until the last tour. And I'm going to answer it now. What do we do? What do you do? My answer, I have no clue. I know the one who does. I know the one who made you. I know the one who gave you gifts and talents. I know the one who placed a passion within you. And He will not forsake a one of His children who goes before Him and say, Lord, I'm ready. I'm sold out. He knows you. I don't have a clue what you should do. All I know is that you should do, and I should do. Oh, I pray that will happen. Father, bless each and every one of these students. May you reveal yourself to them. May they gaze upon your face and not turn away. May you metamorph them, transform them, transfigure them into your image. That is what we seek, and that is what we seek alone. Soli Deo Gloria. In the name of Jesus, amen.